We're all lucky to be here. There's a very special sense in which I am lucky to be here. My dad was the youngest son of a land-owning family. They owned this ranch that I'm sitting on now. His grandfather had owned this ranch where I'm sitting. And being the youngest son, that there was this deal where he was not expected to ranch. The oldest son, his older brother Bill, was the one who was expected to ranch. So my father, from an early age, had an interest in the military. And he spent some fun years, sort of 1935 to 39, in the northwest frontier of India, by the Khyber Pass, by what is now Pakistan. And he was playing polo and hunting wild boars in the forest and really having a good time, and going out with military maneuvers with soldiers in the daytime. And then the war came along, Second World War, and he found himself in Burma fighting the Japanese army. The name of the objective that my father was given was a thing called Bunny Bay, which doesn't sound, it sounds kind of like Easter or something nice, but as you'll hear, it was a pretty serious Bunny Bay, all right. So he studied this. He studied this on maps, to see what the best angle of attack might be. He even made a sand table, which is where you make something out of sand that looks like what's actually there. And he still wasn't satisfied that he really knew what he was going up against, and he wanted to go and have a look at this. And a young officer who'd been away on a course and had got back a day or two early and was just looking for something to do. He sort of wanted to get back into the action, and he said to my dad, "What are you doing?" And my dad told him, and then the guy said, "Oh, well, I'll come with you. Let's both have a look." And my dad said, "Sure, let's both go." So they went. I imagine that the last few yards anyways on this ridge or hill that they had to kind of shinny up on their bellies and then peer over the edge. They had a pair of binoculars, and they were looking at this objective, Bunny Bay. My father had just handed his binoculars to this other fellow, and just handed the binoculars over, and they're looking over the edge, and there's this loud crack, and the other fellow is shot right between the eyes. And my dad looks at this and just goes, "I'm out of here," and takes off down the ridge. So my father he was pretty sad about this guy, but he was also appreciative of the fact of how lucky he was that this sniper had a choice. If he'd been up there by himself, there'd have been nobody to come running back to say he's been shot. Now, as unfortunate as that was, he had got a good look at Bunny Bay, and he knew what he wanted to do the next day. So the next day found him at the bottom of the hill with his company of 100 Garhwali, battle-hardened soldiers, and up the hill they charged. Now, a thing about this hill and this machine gun nest was the machine guns could hit the road very well, but the hill was so steep that they couldn't drop themselves enough, their elevation enough, that they couldn't actually shoot anything that was right on the hill beneath them. So my father and his men were able to go charging up the hill fairly easily until they got very close to the machine gun nest. And as they got close to it, my dad had half turned to encourage his fellows on up the hill, and he saw out of the corner of his eye something come flying out of the machine gun nest, just flying, and it landed underneath him. And what it was a grenade, a hand grenade, and when it landed underneath him, it exploded, and the force of the explosion blew him up through the machine gun fire, and he fell back down to it and got shot all to bits. And that was the end of his fight. That was the end of his battle. He says he remembers hitting the ground, and he never lost consciousness. He says he looks down and he could not see his thumb. In fact, it had been shot clean through, but it was still attached by a flap of skin, and he couldn't see it. And all he thought was, "Oh Christ, they've shot my thumb off." And his men proceeded past him and were able to take this objective. I don't think too many others were badly hurt. And come back down the hill, pick up my dad, and take him to the first aid station, where they got this process, the triage process, where they look at you and they determine that there's nothing they can do for you other than sort of pain control because you're going to die, or they got to get on you right away, or it's very minor and you can certainly wait. And they'd stuck him in the there's no hope for this fellow category. He must have looked really bad, just covered in blood. He had a Batman. The fellow's name was a Batman. A personal servant, someone who was assigned to sort of look after him and make sure he was always sort of clean and pressed and whatnot, a prerogative of being an officer. And this fellow was very attached to him, and he stood over my dad and sort of looked at him and went and bothered the doctors, and they finally said, okay, well look, and so they looked at my dad, and once they got him cleaned up, that they could see that he, as much as he was badly wounded, it wasn't, they'd misdiagnosed it. He was shot in the legs primarily, and the arms, and his thumb. And, there was no organs hit or major arteries or anything, so they proceeded to put him back together. Shipped him back down the line to Calcutta. I think he spent 6 months there, convalescing, and ultimately put him on a ship and sent him home to Great Britain to a convalescence hospital. And while he was at that hospital in Scotland, there was an attractive young night nurse by the name of Margaret McNaughton who was looking after him, and she'd been drafted into the war effort and had chosen to become a nurse. Anyways, they met and became friendly and all sorts of things, and they finally got married. That's my mom. Now, when my dad was wounded, about the time my dad was wounded, there was a letter written by a captain or something, and it was flying its way home from Italy to the ranch here, to my grandparents, my father's parents. And the letter was telling them that their eldest son, the fellow who'd become a rancher, and I mean he had become a rancher, he'd worked here very hard with my grandfather, that their eldest son has been killed in action. My dad, who's wanted to be a soldier all his life, partly because he liked military things, but partly because he had an older brother who was going to be the rancher. Suddenly my dad is the older brother. Suddenly he's been so badly wounded now that the army doesn't really want him, and suddenly he can become a rancher. So he felt lucky about that he had something to come to. Not that his brother was killed, but just that things were certainly working out for my dad. So he gets back here and he starts having kids. Him and Margaret McNaughton, Margaret Kerfoot, now start having kids. I have 3 older siblings and 1 younger sibling. There's 5 of us. Now the thing that's a little bit funny about this, when I'm saying I'm lucky to be here, is that among all the other wounds that my dad got, probably one of the least serious wounds he got as far as threatening his life goes, but this could have had a big effect on my life, the fact that I'm even here, was that a lot of the shrapnel, little pieces of metal that went flying up from this grenade, a lot of the shrapnel went into his testicles. And I mean, that's the sort of thing that can affect your ability to have kids. So those are the various ways in which I am lucky to be here.